Hello historians, it's February 25th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the Battle of Gettysburg. Gettysburg was very significant. It was important. It was also one of the largest battles fought in the Civil War, ever fought in America, actually. So there are really 5 reasons that I'm going to give you that Gettysburg mattered. So if you're a note taker, then you can get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and these are the reasons, okay? So the importance of the Battle of Gettysburg in this Civil War was obvious from the time the battle happened over these 3 days. 3 days worth of battle in rural Pennsylvania in July of 1863. Newspapers were already beginning to write about this enormous and profound battle in the midst of the battle, even before it was over. Over time, it just even increases in importance as historians look at it and analyze it. It's possible to see that this battle between these 2 huge armies that converge in this crossroads town in the countryside of Pennsylvania is one of the most meaningful events in American history. And that's why we're going to talk about it a lot today, and it'll be in your homework and classwork as well. So 5 reasons why, once we get this basic understanding of this battle, that we will see why it's so important to both the Civil War and the general history of the United States. So Gettysburg was definitely a turning point in the war. Like I said, it was fought 3 days in July 1st through 3rd, 1863. And one of the main reasons for its significance is that this was General Robert E. Lee's plan to invade the North and force the immediate end of the war. And the fact is that it failed. Lee hoped also to gather food and much needed clothing and shoes in this prosperous region of southern Pennsylvania. Sometimes we hear about the Civil War, about the blue and the gray, because the Union soldiers wore blue uniforms and supposedly the Confederate soldiers wore gray uniforms, but they didn't really. Many Confederate soldiers were never even issued an official uniform. Some of them did, and they were mostly kind of a butternut brown color. But many of them just wore their regular clothes, and they had been wearing these clothes and marching in these shoes over all of these years of battles and moving and always on foot. And interestingly enough, living in Virginia and living through a Virginia summer, I always think about the Union soldiers in their blue wool uniforms marching through the heat of a Southern Virginia summer, or even a Central Virginian summer. And I just think how difficult that must have been. They must have really been able to adapt to that. But the Confederate soldiers were not getting resupplied very much or very often. And many of them were literally marching barefoot. Their shoes had completely worn out and fallen apart. And so they would often, if they could, they would take shoes off of corpses. And, you just put any old shoe you can wear, you would wear. So it's pretty desperate for a lot of these Confederates in terms of clothing and shoes. So Lee was hoping, okay, this is a prosperous area. Hopefully we can resupply our men with some of these needs. But the other and more important reason was that Lee hoped that if he could get a foothold in this part of Pennsylvania, he could eventually move towards the capital, Washington, D.C. Hopefully, his plan, he would be able to surround the capital and basically conquer the capital, and he could capture high government officials, maybe even the president, and force them to recognize the Confederacy as a real country separate from the United States of America. The Confederate States would be a separate nation, which would have, had he succeeded, been the only slave nation in North America. But we know, of course, that did not happen. And so the other thing they hoped is that they could win this battle, even if they can't invade Washington, D.C., they might get recognition from a foreign nation, maybe Great Britain, maybe France, any nation that's willing to help them economically. because the Confederacy is really struggling economically right now. And so we have these two great armies colliding at Gettysburg, and that's going to put an end to Lee's plan of capturing Washington, D.C. and ending the war that way. After 3 days of fighting all over this area, not just in one place, this was many battles over a period of 3 days, all in that area, on the open fields, on the hills nearby, lots of fighting going on. But at the end of it, Lee was forced to withdraw and take his now badly battered army back through Western Maryland and back into Virginia. Remember, this army is called the Army of Northern Virginia, just to remember that, okay? And the Union Army is sometimes called just the Union Army, and then it has some other names. We'll talk about that another day. So after this defeat at Gettysburg, there would be no more Confederate invasions of the North. That would be it. The war is going to go on for 2 more years. It's only 1863 at this point, but after Gettysburg, it would all be fought in the South. The clash at Gettysburg was enormous by any standards. A total of 170,000 Confederate and Union soldiers came together around a town that normally had like 2,400 residents total. And now here are 170,000 additional human beings at their town. I want you to just imagine for a second, if you had lived during the Civil War and you lived at a place where battles were fought there or nearby, the army, would basically show up and be on your land. And, in Gettysburg, they had used a house there as their headquarters. Imagine, the knock comes on the door and here's a general at your door saying, we'd like to use your dining room or your kitchen as a place to meet and be our headquarters. And, by the way, do you have any extra clothing or food or shoes? Right, so here your little town is 2,400 people, which is not that little, but I mean compared to 170,000 invading soldiers, north and south, that's quite an impact on your small rural farming town. One of the things about Gettysburg is it was a crossroads. If you looked at it on a map, there were roads coming from all directions, kind of like the hub of a bunch of spokes on a wheel. That's the way Gettysburg was. A lot of roads came in there. And the total casualties of this very long, difficult time of battle would be approximately 25,000 men and 28,000 for the Confederates. Over 53,000 men casualties of the Battle of Gettysburg. Gettysburg was the largest battle ever fought in North America. And it would change the face of the war, which was, of course, going to change the face of America. So Gettysburg is very significant, okay? There's also a lot of heroism and drama to be had. A number of movies have been made about it. One in particular is called Gettysburg. And so we have a number of distinct engagements in distinct areas. Each one alone could be called a major battle all by itself. Two of the most significant would be an assault by the Confederates at a place called Little Round Top, which is up a hill. It's a hill, right? There's a series of hills there near Gettysburg, and this happens on the second day. And an interesting guy that you will hear about in your other videos for today, is a man named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. At the beginning of the war, he was a literature professor in Maine, at Bowdoin College in Maine, and he becomes a colonel in the Union Army, and he is put in charge of the 20th Maine. That was his unit, and they were told to hold Little Round Top, to hold this hill. And what happened was they were fighting a regiment from Alabama, and this regiment from Alabama was going to come up this hill, the Little Round Top, where the Union soldiers were, and have a battle and try to take the hill. You always want the high ground, right? When you're in battle, you want the high ground. And so the problem for the Union Army and Chamberlain's men was they had run out of ammunition. They'd been fighting most of the day and the day before. And so Chamberlain at first tells them, take as much ammunition off any of the dead bodies that you can, but it wasn't a significant amount. And here, Alabama's coming up the hill to attack, and they don't have enough ammunition to defend themselves. And so Chamberlain does kind of a crazy, miraculous thing. He tells them to fix bayonets. And what that means is you take out your bayonet. If you don't know what a bayonet is, look it up on, Google or whatever. But it's like a long knife that you can attach to the end of your rifle. And so it almost, now you have a, something to stab people with. And so he says, fix bayonets. And I guess his men looked at him like, what? Like that, we don't do that anymore. But Chamberlain's like, we have no choice. We're going to run down the hill and we're going to yell and we're going to charge with our bayonets. And so the men were willing to follow. They fixed bayonets and he told them to charge, and they went down the hill. And in the midst of all this confusion and craziness, the regiment from Alabama turned and ran, and they succeeded. They won. They won the Battle of Little Round Top, and they held it for the Union. And so that is the story of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He did many other amazing things. That was not the only amazing thing he did in this war. And at the end of the war, General Grant actually chose him to participate in the surrender ceremony. So that was pretty significant. So there's lots to know about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. If you're interested in him, that he's in a movie called Gettysburg. Talk to your parents, see if it's okay for you to watch that movie. It's a very interesting story. So there is another significant and really tragic battle that occurred, and it's known to modern day historians as Pickett's Charge. And Lee decided he would have his second in command, General James Longstreet, organize this charge where they would march across a big open field towards the Union Army. Unfortunately, the Union Army has a low stone wall that they are able to, crouch behind and fire from. They also have artillery up on that hill, those hills that we were talking about. Remember, one of the reasons that the Union needed to hold those hills is for their artillery to be firing shells at the Confederates as they come across this field. And General Longstreet tried to convince Lee that this battle was a mistake, but Lee was firm and he said, this is going to go on. And so General George Pickett is in charge of the charge that would go across the field. And they would literally be marching towards the Union Army, who are behind a low stone wall, so they have protection. They have something that they can be behind. And the Confederate soldiers were just mowed down in the field. They had no chance. And they suffered a terrible, very deadly defeat. And later, General Pickett was asked, General, where is your army? And he said rather bitterly, I have no army, because so many of his men had been slaughtered. And it said that Pickett never, ever forgave Lee for commanding him to, giving him that order to charge across that field. And later, James Longstreet would write a book about the Civil War, and he would place the blame for Pickett's charge on General Lee, which made him very unpopular in parts of the South where Lee was, considered the greatest general who ever lived. So Pickett's charge was pretty much a mess in every way you can imagine. It was a bloody mess. And another interesting tidbit from the Battle of Gettysburg is the heroic cavalry charges. Cavalry, if you don't know, means the soldiers that rode on horses. Okay, and there was a cavalry charge that was led by a young cavalry officer who had just been promoted to general, and his name was George Armstrong Custer. And maybe if you've studied history, you've heard of Custer's last stand. Well, that was not at Gettysburg. Custer did great. He was a hero at Gettysburg. But the thing was later, and we'll talk about it more later as we can move forward, during the Indian Wars, Custer didn't do such a great job. Custer was actually known for always having his uniform perfect and wearing a big hat with a feather and wearing his hair long. And he had blonde hair, so he had this long blonde hair and this big hat with a feather. So he was kind of known as a man who cared about his appearance. And finally, the last thing that makes Gettysburg so significant was the speech that Lincoln gave, which you heard some about in the last lesson, that underscored the war's significance. Gettysburg could never have been forgotten, but its place in American memory was really cemented when Abraham Lincoln visited the site 4 months later, November of 1863, and Lincoln had been invited there to dedicate this new national cemetery for the Union dead. Now, if you remember, we talked about the fact that a cemetery, just a place set aside for the burial of dead people, is new here in the United States, that most people are buried in a churchyard, or if you live way out in the country, you might even have a small family graveyard there on your land where all your family is excuse me, buried together. But now we have so many war dead that we have this new innovation, if you will, of burying people in these large cemeteries together. And so he decides he's going to go to this, and he's going to give a speech. But the speech he chooses to make is very short. This is a time where people would go to hear public speeches. I mean, it was one form of entertainment. They would go and hear speakers talk for hours on end. And as you heard before, Edward Everett spoke for a couple hours before Lincoln came up. And there is not a lot of great photography of Lincoln from the Gettysburg Address, because the photographers, they figured he talked for a long time, and they kind of took their time setting up their equipment. And they have a lot of heavy equipment and all that, and getting in the right place and all of that, that barely any pictures got taken of Lincoln because the speech was so quick. Everybody was amazed. But the speech was quick, but it was full of beautiful words and phrases and wisdom. So I want you to read the Gettysburg Address this week, and actually I want you to rewrite it in your own words as part of your homework. And this war, this speech, part of it is giving a justification for why we're in this war. What's the point of war? What is this about but this new birth of freedom? And of course, the Gettysburg Address has become known as one of the greatest speeches ever delivered. Very short, but brilliant. And in less than 300 words, it expressed the nation's dedication to the cause of freedom that this war was all about. So that's it for me for today. And I will talk to you again on Tuesday. So bye for now.